Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The Human Rights Watch investigated the troubling conditions of communal violence in India. The report, which was released earlier this week, found that lynchings of minorities by cow vigilantes have increased since the BJP government, led by Narendra Modi, came into power in 2014. The damning report also talks about how in almost all cases, the Indian authorities delayed investigations into the lynchings and provided protection to the lynchers. With the evident rise in Hindu nationalism, things seem to be getting worse by the day for minorities in India. On tonight's show, we explore the ongoing violence being carried out in India and what the future looks like. Joining us for this discussion is Justice Ali Nawaz Chowhan, who is the Chairman, National Commission for Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Sir, before we get into what exactly this report states, please tell us who are these cow vigilantes and who makes up the majority of these groups?
These are people belonging to the religious groups. They are sponsored as such, and they have a hate for the Muslims, which is so inherent. When Al-Biruni came to this part of the world, for the first time he declared that there are two people who do not mix up, they are separate. This idea then came forward in 1940, and ultimately we had to go for partition because they were not agreeing on the political side as well. Now, the riots which took place in 1947 is also an evidence of that hate which was because of which they killed Muslims in millions. And the Gurdaspur case where the British sided with them and gave them that portion and allowed the manslaughter. If you read this book, Freedom at Midnight, then by Domenico Lepar, then you will find out the design. And then we also know how Mountbatten exploited the situation. Now, presently, there's a hate for Muslims in India, which formed one of the biggest minority in India, besides the Christians, besides the Buddhists, and the rest. Nobody has been spared.
And Justice, here we're seeing that since 2014, these lynchings have increased. Specifically talking about it, what has the atmosphere been created in India to enable and to embolden mobs carrying out this violence?
Actually, since the advent of Mr. Modi and the decline of the Congress, which was a more moderate party, we find this hatred spreading. You know of the killings which took place in his province when he was the minister, chief minister. And he was banned from going outside. I mean, the countries refused him visas. But now he came on the pinnacle and became the Prime Minister of India, and Indian might of wealth as well as of military and all was a great influencing factor, and Modi would always eclipse.
And Justice, here when we're talking about Modi being championed by the people, does that reflect in any way that the secular values of India are eroding?
Actually, India is not secular at all. It is a Hindu state besides Nepal, and we don't find anything secular except in the abstract and except in the writing and in the constitution and elsewhere. And after the death of Jawaharlal Nehru, we found the real face when Indira Gandhi went seizing the Golden Temple and killing the Sikhs, and got the brunt herself because of the killing. And so on. With the Tamils, even they have been doing all that because it was a low sect. So they strictly believe in their different sects like Brahmins and the rest. So,
Justice Ali, so do you think that this facade of secularism is being taken away from India? Because just going back a bit and exploring into these cow lynchings, of course, the lynchings are there and they're being carried out by a mob. But the fact that there is a beef ban in place shows that the legislation as well is not secular. There is nothing about it that is keeping away religious sentiments. So do you think that this facade that there existed is now falling apart?
Well, you see, what we call in Latin is res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. What may have been written is not enough. We see the real face on ground reality. Take the case of those Christians who were burnt alive. Take the case of the Barbary Mosque. What if the Muslims had constructed a mosque there? They were a minority. They could have built a temple next door. They wouldn't allow that. They won't even allow the judicial system to opine on this. Now, in the case of the marriages, also they were trampling with the family rights, which even the British respected, the family-owned right. So, there's nothing secular.
Okay, so Justice Ali, if there's nothing secular, that of course does not justify violence in itself. Keeping that aside, that India might not be secular in spirit, it is only in word and letter. We are talking about oppression in terms of so many killings on a daily basis. We are hearing more and more violence coming out of there, not just targeted at the Muslims, at the Dalits, at the Christians. What can you tell us about that? How is the state rewarding or protecting the perpetrators of violence here?
Actually, they are rewarding them both surreptitiously and openly, and violence is now the new weapon they are using, both within the country and sending it outside. Let's say in case of Balochistan and elsewhere, they are dabbling in our system and trying to cow us down. But who will excuse India? History will never excuse India in case of the atrocities that are being perpetrated on the Muslims of Kashmir. India has no legitimacy there. And even if there's a constitution provision giving a special status, but have they given a special status with such a big army over there and not allowing people to cross to meet their near families? This is very unfortunate. But what is the problem? It's Hindu Vita. Hindu Vita is just born into them, so that hatred will never go. And that has been repeatedly said even by Al-Biruni.
Justice Ali, hold on to that thought. I do want to explore that concept of nationalism, Hindutva over here. But before that, I'd also like to welcome another guest who's joined us here in the studios, Mr. Asif Aqeel, who's a journalist. Mr. Asif Aqeel, so when we're talking about the persecution of Muslims, we obviously have to keep in mind how other minorities are also being targeted in India, Christians being one of them. Anti-conversion laws, many priests and clergymen are being accused of it, and violence is somehow justified. Tell us about that situation.
Thank you, Meshal, for inviting me on your program. While we are in Pakistan, we mostly think that minorities and other stuff, but we all often forget how they are treated in India. Christian, like Guardian in 2016 reported that each week at least 10 incidents against Christians take place, like burning of a church, beating of a pastor, a mob attack on a Christian. And there have been more than 600 incidents taking place each year against Christians. You can see there was killing and continuously for months in Orissa in 2008. There a lot of churches were burned, Christians were attacked. At least 5,000 had to dislocate and live in villages for over months. So persecution of Christians is not as much as getting coverage in international media.
Why do you think that is, though? Why isn't this issue being highlighted more, since we're talking about systematic persecution here?
So, see, I think India has been successful in projecting itself as a shining democracy, the largest democracy, shining India, and then projecting as we are the growing economy. And so I think also the interest of international other power players, because if it aligns with India, so the persecution of Christians is actually less represented and portrayed in the Western media. I think that could be the one reason. And in recently, as you have reported, World Watch Monitor, a watchdog on the persecution of Christians, it has noted that India, from its number from 36, it has jumped to just close to 10, which is top 10 countries. So I think it's very important that...
Can you tell us, in the Christian community context specifically, what are these anti-conversion laws, and what causes so much violence due to them? Please explain upon that.
One important reason is that most of the Christians in the subcontinent, be it in India, in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, they come from downtrodden, untouchable castes.
The Dalits.
So, yeah, Dalits. And there is a movement in India called Ghar Wapsi movement. They want that whoever converted to Christianity or even to Islam in the past, they are welcome, they want them to come back. The reason is India projects itself that almost 80% of the population is Hindu, which is actually untrue. There are a lot of tribes, tribal and Adivasis, who don't consider themselves Hindu. So in order to keep themselves as a country which is predominantly Hindus, they want to have as many as people who are Hindus.
And Mr. Asif, building on to that concept here, I want to ask Justice Ali that how are democratic values in India being undermined? Because we saw the controversial citizenship bill, which was not passed after several protests, but it has, in the past too, India has stripped many individuals, specifically Muslims, of their citizenship. So while we're talking about the state not being secular, we're also seeing an undermining of democratic values. Please tell us about that.
Well, I totally agree with you. India democracy is so well proffered all over the world, the biggest democratic country. But nobody sees beneath what is happening and how the democratic values when it comes to minorities is being misused, especially in the constituencies where people cannot contest. But this hatred I have experienced myself. I was in a judicial capacity way back in '74 in East Africa. And in Kampala, we had a neighbor, Mr. Sehgal, who belonged to the United Nations. Now, he was one person whom we could converse in our own language, and his wife and the rest. So we were invited 2-3 times to their home, but the wife will not join on the table. She had an excuse or two to work in the kitchen, and we were surprised why she's doing it. Later, we found out that because we were Muslims, we were untouchables. So the lady would not like to take meals with us. I mean, this is the state of things within even families. So we stopped going to their home altogether. So if Muslims are untouchables, so this is both undemocratic and this is against all values of secularism. People are not equal. They are untouchables. And when they are untouchables, they don't even sell things to the untouchables.
Definitely, and that does challenge the principal value of democracy, which is equality here. Thank you so much, Justice Ali Nawaz Chowhan, for talking to us about this. Mr. Asif, so let's build on to that. When we're talking about democratic values being undermined, of course, the question that comes to most people's mind when they think of the milieu of India is the caste system here. So how has that been weakened, or has it not been weakened in coming decades?
One important aspect of caste system is that it is religiously embedded way of thinking, and it teaches that men are not born equal. So when there is violence against untouchables, or who are euphemistically called Dalits, that is actually accepted as religiously accepted. So when you see it taking place, you will see that the state mechanism is also letting it go with impunity. And there was expectation that it will be decreasing, but it has actually strengthened. And if you see the Indian newspapers, for marriage, they will clearly tell which couple, meaning the side of the caste is expected. And then you look at the politics. The entire politics in India is still in the hands of those who belong to the upper caste. Even the Brahmins, almost 60%, and there are estimates.
Yeah.
The main or the policy making and the power structure, almost 60% are from the Brahmin caste.
Yeah.
So caste system is not dying in India, and I can proudly tell you that one of the basic reasons why Christians joined Muslims in the independence movement was the caste system, because, and it's recorded, that they said that it's a thorn in their heart that they were considered untouchable. And our most important and famous leader, SP Singha, who was also the last speaker of the Punjab Assembly, also the first speaker of the Punjab Assembly in Pakistan, he said that wherever Hindus are living, Christians do not have their own wells and they do not have their graveyards. And this, to this day, is continuing in India. And I don't see that this is going to die. You can find places where Hindus, untouchable, they have to take off their shoes when they are crossing a Brahmin's place.
There was an incident where a Dalit groom was attacked and violence was perpetuated against him. And that's just a one-off. There are many other examples there where there is systematic violence and mob violence, which the state also recognizes, but nothing is being done about it.
Meshal, I'm forgetting the year. Probably it was 2016 or 17. Their National Assembly was presented a report that almost 45,000 incidents each year were taking place against the people called Dalits. So it is huge. It's a huge, big number. We only look at the issue of rape. Mostly, we know about the Delhi case and others, but the violence against untouchables and Christians remains mostly unreported. This is what World Watch Monitor has reported, that most of the cases are not even highlighted in media. You can imagine.
Could that also be attributed to the fact that the government is systematically trying to cover those numbers in order to prevent the international community from knowing what is happening inside the boundaries, inside the territory? Because we have heard of how the Modi government has been preventing reports from coming out, from coming into the public. There are a number of reports here which have been prevented from coming out in related to unemployment and many other sectors. So violence also is underreported here.
I think there is even two reasons. One is that the shining India, you want to maintain that image. And the other reason is that like if an untouchable who is sick or needing some medical attention, if he or she goes to the hospital, he wouldn't be touched by a doctor. And if you want to report it in the police station, then they are also part of it.
Yeah.
To them, it's justified. So it will remain unreported. I think this is also about the system, how people at large believe and accept the caste disequalities and caste-based inequalities as normal.
And Mr. Asif, here you did mention something briefly about how we hear more about the rape cases going on in India. Rightly so, you mentioned it, but it is a very grave problem. And with that, I'd like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Ms. Tahira Abdullah, who is a Pakistani human rights activist, joining us from the Islamabad studios. Thank you so much for joining us. So according to a report which was released in June, India remains to be the most dangerous place for women out there. Tell us about why exactly that report stated this claim.
First of all, I would like to start by expressing my condolences and sympathies with the families of those who have become victims of this terrorist attack in Pulwama. That is extremely important for people living on both sides of the line of control, whether they are Kashmiri or Indian or Pakistani, to have the human angle and to show a lot of sympathy and support and condolences for those who are killed. It doesn't matter who kills whom, but when people are killed and people become victims of terrorist attacks, then we stand with them, no matter what religion they belong to or whose army they belong to. And that's the first thing I would like to say. Secondly, the human rights atrocities and outrage that India is carrying out in its portion of Indian-administered Kashmir has now become general knowledge and common knowledge all over the world. And I think it's high time that the United Nations insisted that, like Pakistan allows UNMOGIP, the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, on the Pakistani-administered Kashmir side of the line of control. Similarly, we have now got to insist, and the United Nations has to lead this insistence, that India must allow UNMOGIP observers on its side of the line of control. This has not been allowed to happen. Secondly, I feel it is extremely important that if Pakistan allows international and national media to visit the Pakistani-administered Kashmir on this side of the line of control, how is it that media, whether Indian media or international media, leave alone Pakistani media, that is unthinkable, are not permitted by the government of India to visit Indian-administered Kashmir side of the line of control in order to get absolutely objective, verified, and unbiased accounts of what is happening inside Indian-administered Kashmir.
And after, like you mentioned, that the reaction after the attack in Pulwama shows how there is this very palpable fear amongst minorities, amongst Muslims. Almost 200 students were evicted. They are trying to seek out shelter. What more can you tell us about the human rights conditions right now after the attack?
The conditions of human rights violations is not limited to Indian-administered Kashmir, part of the line of control. It's all over India. And it's not just limited to the Muslims of India. Look at the situation of the Christians of India. The Sikhs are not happy with what is happening in the Indian Punjab. There are movements for secession or liberation all over India. I mean, look at the east, the northeast of India. It's full of liberation movements or breakaway movements or secession, whatever word you want to use. So this is happening all over India, which is what makes the Kashmir situation that much more difficult to find a solution for. I would especially like, since you've asked me about human rights, I would very especially like to mention the situation of the women of Indian-administered Kashmir. Rape is being used as an instrument of war since 1989. And it hasn't ceased. And you know, I strongly recommend a book by Seema Qazi. She's a Kashmiri herself, and she's written about militarism and gender issues in Kashmir. And I've done a book review on that book, and it makes your hair stand on end.
Ms. Tahira, I do want to delve deeper into the how women's rights are being violated in Indian-occupied Kashmir and also in Kashmir in India at a wider level. But before that, I'd like to welcome to our show Rifat Jawaid, who is a journalist joining us from Delhi. So, Mr. Rifat, the Supreme Court of India stated that the lynchings are attributed to a growing sense of intolerance and polarization within India. What can you tell us about the rise of Hindu nationalism, which is causing for this to happen?
Look, we have been experiencing the alarming rise, in the what we call it Hindutva politics. What Hindutva politics is a group of so-called nationalists, led by the BJP, which is in the power at the moment. They have really whipped the sentiments, the pro-Hindu sentiments, in order to, polarize the voters. I don't know if you know that India is going to go for the Lok Sabha elections, which is the parliamentary elections in a couple of months' time. Prime Minister Modi is under scanner because, the lot of election promises that he had made in 2014. He has spectacularly failed on all those promises. He had projected himself as a messiah of development in 2014. Unfortunately, he has been a miserable failure, on all those fronts. So in order to divert the people's attention so that people don't ask you, don't question you on your performance in governance, this is the good ploy that they have found. And they have been slowly building, the sentiments of Hindutva through their social media army. What Pulwama has done is that they have given them a new lease of life. Now their supporters are going to town across India, whipping the pro-nationalist sentiments. And suddenly, nobody is asking the question, because anybody who is asking the questions on government, asking the question on governance, they are suddenly declared as anti-nationals. And people like us who have Muslim names, we also get called as jihadis because you are daring to ask the government a question, which should be the normal job for any journalist. But in India, under Modi government, it has been a different game altogether.
Mr. Rifat, so how over here, when we're seeing these sentiments being intensified, how is secularism in any way justified? How is it reconciled with when we're seeing, like you're saying, these conditions getting even further augmented?
Look, this is a big worry for a person like me who migrated back from UK about 5 years ago to India, hoping that India is no longer the country where the riots take place, where there will be your safety will be under threat, by lunatics in the society. Unfortunately, that has changed, and there is a big debate going on right now that what happens if Modi comes back to power in May. If that happens, there were a lot of people like me who will be rethinking about their decision to stay back in India. That's a big worry. You're talking about secularism. India on paper remains a secular country, but how much of that is being practiced on the ground, which is a big debate. The main opposition party, the Congress party, has also been accused of embarking on what is being called the soft Hindutva. So they are not all out and out Hindutva party.
But those Hindu national sentiments still exist there. On that note, Mr. Rifat, we have to go for a break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we discuss the ongoing violence systematically carried out in India, before going to break, Ms. Tahira Abdullah wanted to pose a question to Mr. Rifat Jawaid. Ms. Tahira, go ahead.
I was listening very carefully to what you were saying just before the break. I just have a question which is sort of exercising my mind a little bit. No one ever had any expectations of Prime Minister Modi's government, the BJP, they're pandering to the far right. We know all this. My question to you is, how do the minorities of India, which includes Muslims and Sikhs and Christians and so many others, feel about the Congress party, which used to be a centrist or even left of center, progressive, so-called self-styled progressive party? They are now starting to pander to the right wing in order to try to chip off some of Mr. Modi's base. How do you feel about their shift to the right?
Mr. Rifat, would you please like to answer this question?
Look, I mean, this is the point I was trying to make before we went into the break. That, the Congress was always an alternative, the secular alternative to Muslims and other minorities in India. What has happened, unfortunately, in the last few years is that Congress thinks that the success of Modi government is largely attributed to the pro-Hindutva agenda. So therefore, they have also started taking a leaf out of their book. Testament to that is a recent example in Madhya Pradesh, where 3 Muslim men who were accused of cow slaughtering, and Madhya Pradesh is now being ruled by Congress. They won the election in December last year. So 3 Muslim men, they were accused of cow slaughtering, and guess what? They have been charged with dreaded Anti-Terror National Security Act. It's not a normal crime. They are now being charged with waging a war against India. That's like, almost equivalent to sedition. So Congress has come under criticism. We have criticized them, but unfortunately, it has not changed anything. And Congress has maintained its stand that they will continue to be, those 3 Muslim men will continue to be tried under NSA, which is National Security Act. So, which is a really, really sad development.
Mr. Rifat, and with the upcoming elections,
can we... many options now.
And with the upcoming elections here, can we expect more violence to emerge while there is pandering to the far right here by political parties in India?
Well, we don't have to go far. One of the known hate mongers, who is also a member of the BJP, called Sadhvi Prachi. She is a motor-mouth hate monger. A couple of days ago when the Pulwama thing happened, her first reaction was making a desperate plea to Modi to say, please Modi, Mr. Modi, please repeat what you did in Godhra. Now what happened in Godhra, if you remember, in February 2002, a train was burned, 59 Hindus were killed. In retaliation, a large-scale riot happened, and lo and behold, Narendra Modi was the chief minister at that time. So Parachi was implying that please repeat Godhra, attack Pakistan, in her words, let Rawalpindi and Peshawar burn so that we extract mileage. So there is a fear, there is a section of the civil society in India which is fearing that the ruling party may resort to that communal violence because that will suit their agenda, because they don't have anything tangible to say on development front.
And that's definitely a very palpable fear on this side of the border, that there will be a perpetration of violence from the government there, and there will be fostering of hate sentiments. We're also joined by Ravi Singh, who's the founder of Khalsa Aid. And after the Pulwama attack, and we saw so many Muslims under threat, so many Muslim students trying to seek refuge, you were involved in that process. Tell us about what are the on-ground sentiments and what are you doing to help?
Yeah, hi. Good day. Well, our team in Patiala, led by Amarpreet Singh, the India team, were alerted to the situation that Kashmiri students were facing, many threats, and many of them took shelter in the gurdwaras in Chandigarh. And we approached them. They were in distress. They felt under threat. And as an organization, humanitarian organization, we reassured them. The Gurdwara committee acted very well and reassured them they're safe, that Punjab is a safe place for them, nothing will happen to them. And then many of them wanted to go home. So our India team then organized 20 buses over 2 days to safely take these students, girls and boys, to their families. But there was a bit of panic amongst them that they felt they had to hide and get away from their accommodations to safety.
And Mr. Ravi, it's very heartening to see how the facilities were being provided by your organization here. But I do have a question to that. Were the authorities in any way trying to facilitate you, helping you help those Muslims who were fearing the situation?
We don't usually wait for any states or governments. We work around any refugee crisis or any crisis around the world. So this was taken purely by the people. And when our local team requested police assistance to make sure that buses reach the border areas safely, they provided it. But we usually work on our own initiative with the local population. And it just shows that, Punjab is a land of humanity, a land of the gurus, but people are spiritual. And as Sikhs, we have suffered a genocide. We don't want anybody else going through that.
Yeah.
And we don't play politics. We just want to get on with it. And we saw those people as our own children, stranded, fearful, and got on with it.
And Mr. Ravi, with all this intensification of Hindu nationalism, how does the Sikh community feel in Punjab, in India, all around? What are their sentiments?
As I said, we don't go too much into politics. There are issues within countries that need addressing. In many countries at the moment, India is facing its own internal issues, like other Asian countries. Our goal remains that when people are facing persecution or they're facing any issues within that we can help, we will be there regardless of their faith, color, or race. But I do sense there is like so many calls for war and conflict now in India that I do not agree with. I think we need a dialogue, we need peace, and both countries need an extra effort. They need to reach an extra mile to sit around a table because this issue has claimed so many lives on both sides.
Yeah.
It is heartbreaking that it continues in this day and age when we want dialogue and peace around the world, but we can't find it in our own doorstep.
Yes, that is a very important point, and stay with us, Mr. Ravi. Ms. Tahira, while we're talking about what needs to be done in terms of protecting minorities, the report of the Human Rights Watch also stated in relation to these lynchings done by cow vigilantes that the police and the authorities were complicit. They often did not take the due action required in order to actively investigate, and when they did, often claims were made that were misleading. For instance, an attack that took place on a Muslim due to cow eating claims was referred to as a motorbike incident. What can you tell us about this? What needs to be done in order to tackle this?
It's not just the Human Rights Watch report, but we set greater store, and there is a lot more credibility to the United Nations Human Rights Council's report of June 2018. All countries are members of the United Nations, and so we must give credence to and credibility to United Nations reports. Unfortunately, India chose to take a very contrary stance to this report when it came out in June of last year, and called it a very biased report. It so happened that the head of the Human Rights Council at that time was a Jordanian, belonged to the royal family, and so somehow or the other it was portrayed in India and by India to the world as some kind of not a very objective report, which is not true. The United Nations doesn't need to take sides unless we won't get into the debate about the United Nations Security Council and the veto powers. That's a separate debate for another day. Let's put it aside. So I set a lot of store by that, and they have talked about the issues that you have just listed. The only solution to this, as I said earlier, and I will repeat now that you have new guests with you, is that UNMOGIP observers from the United Nations Military Observers Group in India and must be allowed freedom of movement.
With that, I also want to ask Mr. Rifat here in regards to the situations in India. There is also turbulence on the economic front. Today is the first day of the second Farmers' March, which is supposed to reach Mumbai by in 7 days, and almost 80,000 farmers are expected to reach there. What can you tell us about that? What is happening there?
Meshal, just a couple of quick points. I must correct you that, by using cow vigilantes, you are actually giving credibility, to the act of terrorism. We, on our platform, we don't use cow vigilantes. We call them terrorists. They are the terrorists who are killing people in the name of one ideology. So let's be absolutely clear. I'm sorry I needed to correct you on that.
No, that's a good point that you've made there.
So number two, this farmer agitation, this is not in isolation. If you remember, this similar large-scale, march past in Maharashtra had taken place many months ago. They had reached Mumbai, and the local government got so scared that they had to accept all their demands. Unfortunately, none of those demands that were met were implemented. More recently, a couple of months ago, similar march was taken place in the national capital, Delhi, where farmers from across Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, they assembled in Delhi, and there was a violence, there was a police lathi charge, it was quelled, but nonetheless, there is a huge resentment, in the farmers' community. And that is what the real worry is for the government.
And Mr. Rifat, can you just take us through what the demands of these farmers are exactly? What have they put forth to the government?
See, what is happening is majority of these farmers, there's something called MSP, minimum support price, that the government had promised to supply to them, because when they grow a crop, they sell it to the government, and government has to give them a minimum support price. Now that minimum support price is not adequate to these farmers, given, in comparison with the cost of, the growing those crops. So clearly, and these farmers, they are heavily indebted. They take loans from the banks, they grow those crops, they sell it to the government. It's not profitable. That's why you see there is an alarming rise in the number of farmer suicides, over the years. I mean, we are not talking about like in hundreds. We are talking about in dozens of thousands. That many farmers die every year because they commit suicide. They are not able to repay the loan. So that's a major, major worry. And most affected the fact that protest march is taking place in Mumbai, which is the capital of Maharashtra. Half of the total number of farmers' suicide takes place in Maharashtra alone. That's how bad it is. So successive governments, now it's a BJP government, has not been able to, meet their demands. Hence, there is a growing protest, and the BJP feels that, they will be punished in the coming elections.
Yes, thank you for that. And I do want to talk to you, Mr. Rifat, more about the unemployment front here in India. But before that, I want to go to Mr. Ravi and ask him what needs to be done in order for the governments, for the authorities to make the minorities feel more safe in this environment. There clearly needs to be action taken right now. What can you recommend?
I think generally minorities, being a minority ourselves, we do see there's a lack of justice. I think all minorities everywhere, every citizen needs to be treated equally when it comes to justice. And at the moment, people like myself, we would encourage anyone to make sure that everything's recorded, any crimes they face, any harassment they face, because we tend not to record anything and just have a word of mouth. But there are calls for equal justice, which is not happening, and it's always the poor that suffer the most. So yes, minorities all over the world, in India especially, they do need to change the way they report, change the way they approach situations, and be a bit more social media savvy to seek justice. Sadly, nowadays, the only justice many minorities get is on social media, and that needs to change, where the government needs to take equally the same sort of action against everyone. It doesn't make a difference if they're rich, poor, low caste, high caste, minority or not. And that's at the moment isn't happening.
And Mr. Ravi, that's a very important point, that equal justice needs to be carried forward. Would like to welcome Syed Tajamul Imran, who's a student activist joining us from Delhi. Mr. Tajamul, here while we're talking about justice, what can you tell us in regards to the minorities, specifically the youth? What are their sentiments? How are they feeling? And what's going on?
First of all, it is not the first time that we are facing such issues. We are facing it from last 30 years now. This is not the first time we have been harassed in the Indian states. This is not the first time we have been thrown out from our rented rooms. This is not the first time we have been beaten in our colleges, whosoever is studying in Indian states. Okay, the main thing is that people of India, particularly the civil societies, need to understand that it is not only about the human rights only. It is not only about our education as well. It is about the basic conflict. There is a conflict in Kashmir, and because of that, we are suffering from Kashmir to Delhi, everywhere in the Indian states. Number one. Number two, I fail to understand why always we, student community, is being targeted in Indian states. We no doubt that we travel there, we study there, but we pay for our studies, we pay for everything. But every time whenever they do such things, they beat us, they harass us, it indicates, it gives us a message that we do not belong to them, they do not belong to us. They treat us like Dalits, they treat us like untouchables. So that is itself a concern. That the basic thing is, you need to understand that Kashmir is beyond the law and order issue. It is a conflict there, and because of that, we are suffering time and again.
And Mr. Tajamul, just to get a sense of the institutional form of and systematic form of persecution taking place here, do not the colleges, the university authorities do anything to protect their students here?
Look, it is not about the universities. It is not about some particular colleges. At times, whenever there's such things happen in any college, in any university, you need to go and check and search in the Google. You will find that hundreds of students from Kashmir have been thrown out by the universities itself, by the professors, by the management itself. Leave the local people aside, take them aside for a moment. Okay, you just check it. From last 4 days, we have approximately 50 cases where 50 students from Kashmir have been thrown out by the university management or college management because they have made some comments and all that. Whenever there is such thing is happening with Kashmiris, when if they will post like this, obviously, if my brother gets killed at home, I have a full authority to write about it. What is bad in that? And there is a freedom of expression. In case I use that freedom of expression on social networking, why I am being thrown out from an university?
Yes.
And why not the same has been done with those who are abusing us or who are writing against us, and just because that they belong to Indian states and we belong to Kashmir.
That definitely shows grave state of injustice there. Thank you, Mr. Syed, Tajamul, Imran, for joining us and talking to us about the on-ground situation. Ms. Tahira, while we're talking about this, you've heard what Mr. Tajamul talked about, the state of the youth. What more can you tell us from the reports coming out, how the youth specifically are facing violence in India and in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
There's two things, certainly. In Indian-administered Kashmir as opposed to Pakistani-administered Kashmir, the two sides of the line of control, youth are suffering a double burden. One, militarization of the government of India, and two, militarism, which is an indigenous movement within the Indian-administered Kashmir. The militarism there is having a two-pronged effect. So one, people are fighting the war of liberation, the struggle of liberation for freedom of expression and for their own freedom. I strongly feel that the word Azadi, that is the slogan of Kashmiris, is a war of freedom and liberation from everyone. It's a war of independence, which means an independent, free Kashmir. Neither yours nor mine. It has to be a free country for the word Azadi, freedom to mean something.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The youth are suffering a lot of alienation, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of psychological issues. Then there is the kidnappings and the involuntary and forced disappearances, which is not just of young men, but of a lot of other people. So there are many women inside an Indian-administered Kashmir who are called half-widows.
Yeah.
The word half-widows has been coined only after the Kashmir indigenous
Ms. We're running short on time, so here I just want to pose the last question to Mr. Rifat Jawaid. What needs to be done by the civil society at a point when the government is clearly carrying out violence, is clearly oppressing minorities?
We don't really have much hope from this government. We are just hoping that the new party, whichever comes to power, hopefully in May, the stability will prevail, and they will realize the significance of winning the hearts and minds of the minority community. In the context of Jammu and Kashmir, the Pulwama that happened, I think I'd just like to add to what Mr. Syed was saying, is that the reasons why such a lot of violence has taken place and why we are horrid of the militancy. It's what we reported 3 years ago called homegrown militancy. You have lost the trust level of the local population, and hence the rise in homegrown. So therefore, there is no human intelligence at the local level. You use pellet guns and civilians. It doesn't do any good to your ability to win the hearts and minds of that population.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Rifat Jawaid, and talking to us about this. Mr. Asif, here we've talked a lot about what is happening currently. What needs to be done in terms of bringing about some meaningful systematic changes, some meaningful structural changes to target the issue of the caste system, to target the issue of minority persecutions in India?
I think one which was raised earlier was the justice system.
Yeah.
We have seen that Supreme Court in India has done a lot. And I think the justice system at the police level needs to be addressed in India. because their courts are working. Now, the second thing is that the international community should take notice of it, and they should see how religious minorities, women, and even the people who want to have their right to freedom, they should be seen in the light that they are human beings.
Definitely, and that's a very important point, to humanize what is happening. And that, with that, I'm going to take my last question to Mr. Ravi here. What needs to be done to humanize this this persecution, to put a human face on the people who are being persecuted? Who's in charge of doing that at this point?
I think, first of all, in any parts of the world where I worked, we need to stop dehumanizing people by labeling everyone as a terrorist. And on my social media, since the last few days, we've been helping the Kashmiri students. I had nothing but abuse from many groups in India. You're helping terrorists. Every Kashmiri is a terrorist. And we stand by what we've done. We will continue to help anyone who needs help. So to humanize someone or a nation or a community or people, you've got to stop before dehumanizing them. As we dehumanize refugees at the moment, we dehumanize in the West.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ravi Singh. We're running out of time. Thank you for giving us that last comment. Thank you, Mr. Asif Aqeel, for joining us. Thank you, Ms. Tahira Abdullah, for joining us. Thanks for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.